Hello and welcome to Spencer's Library. I'm Claudia and today I'm reviewing Venetia by Georgette Heyer. This was published in 1958. It's the second Georgette Heyer book I've read. You can find my review for the first Georgette Heyer book I read, which was The Unknown Ajax, in the description box if you're curious. Venetia is a novel about a young lady by the name of Venetia. 25-year-old Venetia Lanyon is a bit of a social recluse. She lives with her teenage brother on her enormous Yorkshire estate, which she also manages. And she manages that estate because her older brother, who inherited the estate from their deceased father, is off with Wellington's Army of Occupation, and by all accounts having a grand old time in occupied France, celebrating the victory over Napoleon with a lot of parties. Venetia's world is really very small. There's the aforementioned younger brother Aubrey, who's a bit of a nerd and spends his days reading classical Greek literature and daydreaming about finally going off to university. Then there's Venetia's two suitors. There's Oswald Denny, who's only 19 years old and wildly in love with her. Denny thinks himself a bit of a rake and is really not. The other one of Venetia's suitors is Edward Yardley, who's a bit older and a very reliable sort, whom she inevitably finds incredibly boring. Obviously, Venetia doesn't want to marry either of them. At 25, she's getting to an age where the neighbours are talking about her and about how, if she's not careful, she might well end up an old spinster. Venetia's father, who is already dead by the beginning of the book, was by all accounts an eccentric. After the death of Venetia's mother, he basically shut himself off in the house. He didn't care for his children, he didn't interact with them, but he also didn't allow them to do anything or go anywhere. So Venetia grew up very isolated and very much with her brother as her only confidant. That makes her, as a main character, quite interesting because she's not shy or awkward, but she's very nonchalant about the trappings of society. She regularly scandalizes her lady visitors and doesn't really care about the form and function of society. She's not impolite, she's not rude, she's not a modern, not like other girls type heroine, but she just can't be bothered with most of what society expects her to do. So overall, at the beginning of her book, her days consist of her fighting off her two suitors, who obviously don't take no for an answer, otherwise they wouldn't be unlucky suitors in a Regency romance novel. The status quo is interrupted by, can you guess? That's right, the arrival of a rake in the neighbourhood. An actual rake. And he arrives in the shape of Lord Damerel, whose name is synonymous with scandal, ever since he made off with a married lady when he was a younger man. By the time we meet him, Damerel has been disappointed by the trials of life. The married lady he made off with as a young 20-something has long since left him, and he's a bit older, though by all accounts still living a rather scandalous life. Damerel and Venetia meet, romance ensues. There's also a bit of family drama thrown in, just as you'd expect. I'm not going to spoiler the plot for you here. I enjoyed this book quite a bit. Heyer's writing is just absolutely top-notch. The way she writes is feather-light, really funny, very entertaining, and really bridges that gap between a modern, as in 1950s, romance and the sort of sparkling societal satire that we know from Jane Austen. You can tell she's done her homework. She's really writing the time periods in a very vivid but still accessible way that I really enjoyed reading about. It's the sort of historical novel where you don't have to have a degree in history to understand it. You're also not getting a lecture in history, which I love. You're in the middle of events. The death of the Queen, Napoleon's defeat in France, all of these like historical events that happened in the year 1818 when this is set, they're just beautiful set dressing for the story that unfolds within that world. But what really makes it come to life is the characters. Venetia as a heroine I quite enjoyed because she is interesting but plausibly so. I really dislike it when in a historical novel that's set, for example, in the Regency, when the author just takes a completely modern woman, modern person, and drops them right in the middle of 1818 and then expects the reader to believe that. It's lazy characterization. Venetia is not that. She certainly exhibits a lot of main character traits. She is, independent, and she is not quite part of the world that she inhabits. I feel like that's always a deciding factor that makes a protagonist, is that they aren't entirely comfortable in the world they're in. But it's plausibly explained within the time period why she grew up a certain way, why she behaves a certain way. And part of that characterization is her indifference to scandal. When she hears about Damerel, she's mostly curious about him. And everyone who's warning her off, she doesn't quite understand what the big deal is. And that's not because she's such a cool girl who doesn't care. It's because she grew up in this isolated environment that makes society a not very deciding factor in her life. There's a part in the book where she is dropped into society, where she goes to London and she experiences it, but she experiences it as an outsider. And to see her come to grips with that idea of society and of scandal is a really interesting part of the story. Venetia, like I said, lovely main character, but my heart belongs to her little brother Aubrey. I have to say, I have a bit of a weakness for literary little brothers. They feature a lot, specifically in 20th century literature, where you have a heroine in her 20s with a university-aged brother. And Aubrey is one of the best examples of that trope. He is so delightfully himself. He is entirely absorbed in his own life and cares very little about what goes on around him, which I adore. He's this book nerd. In the very first scene, we see him completely ignoring his sister as she's trying to tell him something. In the very last scene, we see him completely adorably ruining a moment. No further spoilers there, but it is delightful. And much like Venetia, you get the idea of a fully rounded person who lives in the time that he inhabits, but isn't entirely at ease with the world around him. It's fascinating to see how Georgette Heyer writes Aubrey's disability, or specifically how she writes the way that this little Yorkshire society reacts to his disability, because Aubrey has an unspecified physical disability of the hip, so that he can't walk very well and suffers from aches and pains, which is also the reason why he lives as a teenage boy with his older sister in their enormous Yorkshire estate and isn't at boarding school like you'd expect for someone his age. Because of this, he is patronized about as much as Venetia is herself. Venetia is patronized because she's a woman who, even though she runs this estate, as in the actual business side of it, because she's a single woman who hasn't seen much of the world. And Aubrey's patronized in a very similar way because he's a boy with his head stuck in books who hasn't seen much of the world. And there's this real us versus them mentality that bonds these siblings together that is really lovely to read about. If we look at the plot of Venetia, some of the twists are frankly ridiculous. And Georgette Heyer has this habit of writing a few chapters during which nothing happens. Delightful chapters with really fun conversations and descriptions and, just lovely to read, but nothing moves forward in the plot. And then, boom, a new character appears. And that's sort of her get out of jail card, right? A new character appears. Halfway through, a new character appears. Then the status quo changes. The characters are in a different place and they go on like that for a bit. And then a new character appears and things change again. And it gets a little bit not predictable, because you can't ever predict these random characters who show up and change everything, but it gets a bit trying after the second or third time that happens. But to be completely frank, that doesn't matter at all. And the plot gets to a point where all of these interesting questions are raised and not many of them are answered by the end. It feels a little bit like she got fed up of writing this story and so she brought it to an end without tying it up into a neat little bow like we expect from a novel. Even with its sometimes trying plot twists, this book is incredibly fun to read. And while it is primarily a romance, it also touches on some really interesting subjects. And I think the biggest one that this book deals with is the idea of independence. We see that in Venetia trying to make her own choices rather than having to follow the path set out by her well-meaning neighbors and friends. We see that in Aubrey in trying to live his life as he wants to without everyone patronizing him and underestimating his abilities. We see that in Damerel, whose choice and striving for independence has made him a marked man for life. Damerel, as a romantic hero, is a lot more traditional, I would say, than Venetia. He's a rake. He has a past. He doesn't think he could ever fall in love because he's very much more of a lady of the week type, if you know what I mean. But the interest in him is not him as a character, because like I said, he's a very standard rake type character, but it is in how Venetia reacts to that. And most of the time she just reacts with a shrug, going, yeah, so what? Lord Damerel likes the occasional orgy. I mean, who doesn't? And the conflict is not really between him and her, and will they or won't they? There's a bit of that as well. Obviously, it wouldn't be a romance novel without it, but it's more in how is Venetia going to handle everyone else. She can handle Damerel, but how is she going to deal with the rest of the world? And this topic of independence, of finding your own path, is explored in her relationship with Damerel, but is also explored in her relationship with her own family, in Aubrey's relationship with everyone else, and to some degree in the two suitors. And I think that part is really brilliantly executed. So yeah, I enjoyed Venetia a lot. I'm certainly going to explore more of Georgette Heyer's writing. This was really quite different to The Unknown Ajax. I think I enjoyed this one a lot more, and I'm looking forward to seeing where my Georgette Heyer journey takes me next. Thank you for watching. Bye!